Hello everyone. Jude 1:5. Here's a passage which demonstrates just how far Trinitarian academia will go to try to promote their doctrine. But when you look at the facts closely, it also shows their incompetence. So let's just have a look at the ESV translation of Jude 1:5. Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. So Jesus wasn't so passively peaceable in the Old Testament. He destroyed the people of Israel who went through the Red Sea and afterward didn't believe. Jesus saved Israel out of Egypt, according to the ESV and the Net and the Douay-Rheims. Here's what these other translations say. The Lord saved the people out of the land of Egypt. That's quite a different thing to say Jesus saved a people out of the land of Egypt versus saying the Lord saved a people out of the land of Egypt. Right? One of the things about this particular translation, the one that says Jesus saved Israel out of Egypt, is that it is so incredibly easy to prove that that is impossible. It's easy to prove that that manuscript reading is wrong. First of all, the name Jesus is a name that was given to a baby human being. Matthew 1:21. You see the same thing in Luke as well. That's what Mary and Joseph were instructed to call that baby. That human baby. That's the first problem. The second problem is that their reasoning doesn't even make sense. In Trinity world, it was the triune God. The God of Israel is thought to be the triune God, a three-person God, and the triune God saved Israel out of Egypt. So there's a big problem with this idea that Jesus saved Israel out of Egypt. Because in the doctrine of the Trinity, the Son is not the triune God. He is not a three-person being. He's one person. He's a member of the triune God. And the triune God is not the Son. Vice versa. These two, the Son and the triune God, are not the same identity. So if the Son saved Israel out of Egypt, the triune God did not, because the Son is not the triune God. And if the triune God saved Israel out of Egypt, the Son did not, because they're different identities. Here's what's wrong with their reasoning. I'll give you an analogy. John Lennon was a member of the Beatles. The Beatles sold more record albums than any other artist in history. However, it would be a complete lie to say John Lennon sold more record albums than anyone else in history, because he didn't. The Beatles did, and he was a member of the Beatles, only one member of the Beatles. John Lennon is not the Beatles, and the Beatles is not John Lennon, just like Jesus is not the three-person God, and the three-person God is not Jesus. Likewise, Jesus is only one member of the triune being, just like John Lennon is only one member of the Beatles. So you can't ascribe what the Beatles did to John Lennon. You could say he participated, but you can't say he did what the Beatles did. That would be like saying that a halfback won the football game. One person won the football game. That's not true. The team won the football game. And one person isn't the team, and the team isn't one person. Same thing. So you would be telling a lie if you tried to do that sort of thing. And so if you try to say the triune God saved Israel out of Egypt, and then in the next breath you say Jesus did it, you're obviously lying. You're telling a lie. You just can't say Jesus was included and that somehow makes it work, because it doesn't make it work for John Lennon or the football player. And you should keep this in mind, because Trinitarians do this kind of thing a lot with Old Testament verses. On one day they'll say a certain verse is the triune God doing it or speaking it, and the next day they'll say Jesus, that's Jesus speaking it, or Jesus doing it. For example, the triune God says, I am the first and the last, and in the next breath they'll say, that's Jesus in the Old Testament saying I'm the first and the last. Well, you can't have it both ways. Because in your own doctrine of the Trinity, those are two different identities. Jesus is not a three-person being. He is not the triune God. So that should be your first clue. The second thing is, the God who saved Israel out of Egypt spoke to Moses and to the people of Israel. It tells us that in Exodus. The Bible also tells us that the God of Israel did not speak to Old Testament Israel through the Son. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets, but in these last days, He has spoken to us in a Son. Hebrews 1:1-2. That statement would make no sense whatsoever if God had been speaking to Israel, the triune God, had been speaking to Israel in the Son in the Old Testament. Hebrews 1:1-2 wouldn't make any sense at all. Why would you say this if the Son had been speaking to Israel all along? You wouldn't. It would be a ridiculously meaningless thing to say if God had been speaking to Israel in a Son all along. It says, but in these last days, He has spoken to us in a Son. You wouldn't say something like that if it had been happening all along. There's another proof that it was not the Son delivering Israel out of Egypt, or speaking to Israel. Because the one that delivered Israel out of Egypt also spoke to Moses, and he spoke to the people of Israel out of the fire on the mountain. And the Bible also tells us plainly, if you just look for the answers, that it was the Father who saved Israel out of Egypt. For example, Matthew 2:15, only the Father of Jesus could have said, out of Egypt I called my son. Those are the words of the Father. And Matthew 2:15 is quoting Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Out of Egypt I called my son, Israel, out of Egypt. And there's a little more about that at Exodus 4:22-23, where God calls Israel my firstborn. Israel was God's firstborn son. All right? And that's because Israel in the Old Testament is a shadow of Jesus and the body of Christ. Paul talks about that at Colossians 2. Out of Egypt I called my son. The Father had to be saying that, or Matthew couldn't be quoting it. Matthew 2:15. It's not going to make any sense. That was the Father saying that at Hosea 11:1. The Father delivered Israel out of Egypt. There are several more ways that you can prove that it was the Father who delivered Israel out of Egypt. This is just a quick and easy way. What we have here at Jude 1:5 is incompetence. Men who are so blinded by their desires to support a man-made doctrine. Look what we made. Look what we made, Mommy. An extreme immaturity that they can't think objectively. And they don't even search the Bible to see if there's an answer. They're too busy trying to promote their man-made God. The one that is the product of their own reasoning process, where they come to a conclusion which they themselves say is incomprehensible. That's just insane. You reason something out, you come to a conclusion, and then you say, my conclusion is incomprehensible. But such is the insanity of the doctrine of the Trinity. Incompetence. Total incompetence. It was the Father of Jesus who saved a people out of the land of Egypt. Just think about this. You don't have to think about this very hard. When young Jesus, say 16, 18, 20-year-old Jesus, was reading the scriptures, the young Jew Jesus, under the law, and he was reading the scriptures about God delivering his forefathers out of Egypt, do you really suppose he was thinking, yeah, that was almighty me. Those were the good old days? Or do you think he just might have been thinking something more like, how great is my Father, my God? I think you know the answer to that. I think you know the answer. God bless you.